Yesterday was a big day as Cirrus announced the G7 version of their popular Cirrus SR22. Now, these Cirrus model changes seem to happen about every 7 years, and often they include a switch to an entirely new avionics system. And if you're wondering what system they changed to, well, stick around as we'll answer that question and more after the news. Hello, my name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books, and I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week, we talked about some recent VFR into IMC accidents and other weather-related loss of control accidents. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/309. And if you're new to this show, take a moment right now, reach down on your phone and touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Coming up in the news for the week of January 8th, 2024, more details about the Alaska Airlines exit door plug accident. A laser-wielding man, first identified by one of our listeners, is sentenced. And an Arizona man wanted on a murder charge in connection with his 2019 fatal crash is arrested. All this and more, and the news starts now. Our top news story is that Cirrus has announced the long-anticipated G7 version of the SR22. And we'll talk about it in depth, including all the major feature changes later in the show. From paddleyourown.canoe.com, more details about the Alaska Airlines accident in which an emergency exit door plug blew out of the plane last week as it was climbing out of Portland. Those details include the cockpit voice recorder data was lost after it was automatically written over just 2 hours after the accident. The flight deck door was ripped open by the force of the depressurization. The force of depressurization ripped the first officer's headset off her head, and the quick reference handbook used by pilots to troubleshoot emergencies was sucked out of the flight deck. There was damage throughout the cabin. 2 tray tables were sucked out the hole, along with 2 mobile phones, both of which were found on the ground. One was an iPhone that still worked after dropping 16,000 feet. Bob Sauer, a Portland physics teacher, found the missing door plug in his backyard. So on Tuesday, officials from the NTSB, including NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamady, visited his classroom. In a tweet, she said, "We hope to inspire the next generation of NTSB employees during the visit." And United Airlines announced that it had found loose bolts on the door plugs of multiple 737 MAX 9 planes. From AustralianAviation.com, airliner veers away after aircraft takes off on same runway in New South Wales. A 34-seat regional airliner was forced to veer out of the way of a Piper Cherokee that took off on the same runway at Shell Harbour in New South Wales, Australia. An ATSB report into the incident last July revealed the smaller aircraft's pilot spotted the larger Saab 340 ahead, but chose to continue anyway, despite it being almost certainly possible to abort. Investigators concluded the Piper pilot used non-standard radio phraseology on approach, and then didn't hear the other plane's vital communication that it was going to backtrack down the same runway. Now, here in the U.S., we would say back taxi rather than backtrack. The Piper eventually flew over the left wing of the Saab at 150 feet. Derek Hoffmeister, the ATSB's manager of transport safety, revealed the Piper pilot wrongly assumed the Saab would be using the taxiway and not the runway after landing. Quote, "They were unaware that a weight restriction on the taxiway meant the Saab had to use the runway to backtrack, and so when they saw the Saab beginning to turn at the end of its landing, they turned their attention to other aircraft in the circuit." The pilot involved was a student pilot from another airport who'd been signed off by an instructor for a solo navigational training exercise to the Shell Harbour Airport. From KIRO7.com, Washington state man sentenced to prison for aiming lasers at 2 small planes. Now, you may recall that in October in episode 296, we talked with Jonathan Fay, who was struck by a laser while flying and against all odds tracked down the perpetrator. This is the final chapter of that story. A 41-year-old man was indicted in February 2023 for the incidents that were reported on November 20th, 2022. He's been in custody since his bond was revoked in August of 2023. U.S. District Judge Richard A. Jones said the act temporarily damaged the pilot's vision and was very dangerous, life-threatening, and done without regard for the victims. At about 5 p.m. on November 20, 2022, the man pointed a blue laser at the cockpit of a 2-person aircraft that was on track to land at Arlington Airport. As a result, the pilot's eyes were damaged and he was unable to see the instrument panel. After switching on the backlight for the instrument screen, the pilot was able to safely land the plane. The pilot also required medical treatment for the injury to his eye. 2.5 hours later, The man pointed the laser to 4-seat aircraft being flown by a student pilot. The man was sentenced to 8 months in prison plus 3 years of supervised release with intensive addiction and mental health treatment. From avweb.com, Diamond Factory Maintenance misrigged a DA42 rudder. Canada's Transportation Safety Board says Diamond Factory Maintenance staff misrigged the rudder cables on a DA42NG, contributing to an accident that heavily damaged the twin. In its final report, the TSB said the plane, registered to the company's U.S. sales division, was on its post-maintenance test flight on May 25, 2022, when it yelled left on takeoff and the pilot was unable to properly control it. The aircraft landed heavily on the grass at London Airport, where Diamond has its North American headquarters, and was badly damaged. The pilot suffered minor injuries. Examination of the aircraft revealed that rudder cables had been installed incorrectly after some worn control cable guide tubes were replaced during heavy maintenance of the aircraft. The TSB report said the worn tubes were discovered by an apprentice mechanic who was then tasked with replacing them. When he put the system back together again, he set up the cables incorrectly, and that resulted in the rudder moving in the opposite direction to control movements. This was the first time the apprentice changed the rudder cable guide tubes on a DA42, and he was not aware that they had to cross over each other, the report said. The apprentice's prior experience with rudder controls at Diamond was on a DA20 aircraft. The rudder cables on that aircraft run parallel to each other. The TSB said the pilot did a thorough pre-flight inspection, but that it's difficult for the pilot to see the rudder when checking control movement, and he did not notice that the rudder moved opposite to control inputs. And we have an unusually large number of stories about pilots who've crashed after breaking regulations or the law. So many, in fact, that I'm starting to think that flying is actually fairly safe for those of us who try to follow all regulations for every flight. This first one comes from planeandpilotmag.com, and it's the story of a Cessna 170 that was attempting to fly for nearly 6.5 hours. The 38-year-old pilot had a commercial FAA pilot certificate with seaplane and instrument ratings. The NTSB report estimates he had 650 hours of flight time, and at the time of the crash, he did not have an FAA medical certificate. The trip had started in Kodiak, Alaska the day earlier. The planned destination was Lake Havasu City, Arizona. He stopped in Sitka and then in Ketchikan, where he spent the night. Both wing tanks were filled, as was an auxiliary fuel tank in the fuselage. The aircraft had no record of the third tank in the maintenance logs. The NTSB analysis of fuel receipts indicated its capacity was around 15 gallons. The Great Circle distance between the Ketchikan Airport and the William Fairchild International Airport in Port Angeles is 531 nautical miles. While both airports are in the U.S., almost all of the route is along the Canadian coastline, and in the middle half of the journey there are almost no alternate airports available. Using the 170A owner's manual performance data quoted by the NTSB for a 140 horsepower engine and two 20-gallon wing fuel tanks, the flight does not seem possible. The mysterious fuselage tank added an extra 10 to 15 gallons, which would increase the published range figures by about 25 to 37%. With favorable weather, the flight seems technically possible. The pilot departed Ketchikan at about 10 a.m. local time. He was texting with his mother, and here are some of those texts from his mother. Are you on the ground? You still appear to be at Port Hardy. From the pilot, nasty headwind. I'm just past Comox, not sure if I have enough gas. May land in Canada. Been in the air for 5.7 hours. GPS says 1.1 more hours, 57 gallons at 6 to 10 gallons per hour. It's a tough call. It should make it. And his mother says, average 8.38 gallons per hour. Will you get there on fumes? What's your ETA now? Pilot, 29 minutes. It keeps changing. I'll be doing 90 knots, then cross a peak and suddenly 60. 30 minutes later, the pilot made the Mayday call, sent his mother a photograph of the barge she was aiming for, and ditched in the water. The onboard ELT activated, but its older design didn't help authorities. Multiple ships and aircraft searched for 22 hours. It's presumed the aircraft sank. Probable cause, total loss of engine power due to fuel exhaustion. And the author of this story writes that 6 months before the accident, the pilot visited a medical examiner to renew his FAA second class, but because of the pilot's reported DUI incident a few months earlier, the AME could not issue a medical that day. The FAA requested more information, which the pilot did not supply. And then the author speculates that perhaps the DUI made him think twice about landing in Canada, which has strict entry requirements for people with what are considered indictable offenses. And from GeneralAviationNews.com, no flight experience proves fatal for kit airplane builder. According to the pilot's friend, the pilot had been working on the kit airplane, a Christavia Mk1, for several months in preparation to have the aircraft certified. The pilot texted his friend to ask if he could taxi the airplane on the private airstrip, which was located at the friend's residence near Oral, South Dakota. At the time of the pilot's request, the friend was not at home. The friend arrived home about 4:45 p.m. and observed the pilot taxiing the airplane. At about 5 p.m., the friend observed the airplane depart, and the pilot completed 2 touch-and-go landings on the private airstrip, then departed to the south. About 5:20 p.m., the friend texted the pilot to inquire about his location, and there was no response. The friend then departed in his plane to look for the pilot. The friend located the accident aircraft, which had crashed in a field near the pilot's residence. According to the pilot's friend and FAA records, the pilot did not hold a pilot certificate and had no previous training or flight experience. And thanks to Rob Mark for pointing out this story to me. This comes from flightglobal.com. Only one pilot in the cockpit of an Astra jet badly damaged in a Las Vegas overrun. U.S. investigators have determined that only one pilot, rather than the 2 required, was flying a Westwind Astra business jet when it landed long and overran at North Las Vegas Airport. Both occupants of the cockpit provided false names after the accident, but investigators later determined that only one of them was a pilot. The aircraft, November 771 Delta X-ray, had taken off from the airport on November 14, 2021, and operated within the traffic pattern. But after conducting its approach, it touched down 2,000 feet along runway 30 right, which has a length of about 4,200 feet. The aircraft skidded off the runway end, and its nose gear and main landing gear were sheared off before the plane came to a rest. When the FAA tracked down the pilot, he said that he had been one of 2 contract pilots hired to carry out a pre-sale flight of the Westwind, and claimed he had not known the name of the other pilot. He also said this other pilot had been commanding and sitting in the left-hand seat. But after discovering that the other contract pilot had been in Florida on the date of the accident, the FAA learned that the second occupant of the aircraft was not a pilot but a passenger. The inquiry eventually determined that the passenger was a family friend. It points out that the Westwind requires a minimum of 2 pilots at the controls. And finally, from avweb.com, Arizona accident pilot arrested in Utah after 4 years at large. The St. George News reported that as a result of a traffic stop, the Utah Highway Patrol arrested a man facing charges related to a 4-year-old fatal aircraft accident. The Arizonan, age 47, was wanted on federal charges including involuntary manslaughter related to the crash of a 1958 Piper PA-2 Tripacer that he was flying in January of 2019. The passenger, his girlfriend of 3.5 years, was killed. Among other discrepancies related to the accident, FAA records revealed that the pilot was issued a student pilot certificate in 2014, but despite numerous reports that he flew regularly with passengers, he had never been issued a private pilot certificate. In addition, he failed to report to the FAA that he'd been an insulin-dependent diabetic since 2002 and used an insulin pump for self-treatment. Without a waiver, such a condition is disqualifying for a pilot medical certificate. His girlfriend was the non-pilot owner of the aircraft and was his passenger on the fatal flight. She reportedly bought the Tripacer for him to fly. The pilot told first responders that 10 minutes after takeoff from Kingman, Arizona, the engine lost power and he tried to return to the airport. It crash-landed in rough terrain, rolled over, and ended up in its back in a ravine. His girlfriend died at the scene, and he was seriously injured. The examination of the aircraft showed no evidence of fuel in the tanks or surrounding ground. It also revealed that both fuel caps were missing, drawing investigators to the conclusion that the pilot failed to replace them after fueling or attempting to fuel, and that whatever fuel was in the tanks was quickly siphoned off in flight. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and then later we'll talk about the new Cirrus SR22 G7, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Chris Keynes. He just passed his private, his PPL, he says. Thank you for making us all safer through quality aviation topics and news. Thanks so much for your kind words, Chris, and congratulations. Also, let me take a moment to remind you that this is a listener-supported show, and we've got a few new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. So if you've been listening for a while, hey, why don't you go ahead and give back? Just going out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, the Cash App, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the air. Now, I want to mention that AOPA's Air Safety Institute has released a new 7-minute video that offers strategies to mitigate airframe icing risks. It's number 7 of a series of videos they call Beyond Proficient IFR video series. I watched the videos, and one of the best parts is where it shows how to use the newly redesigned aviationweather.gov website to bring up various weather products that can show you icing-related information. It also reviews pre-flight considerations to avoid in-flight icing and what to do when you encounter icing conditions in flight. And I'll include a link to it in the show notes. And probably my favorite icing course is the one offered by Cirrus at cirrusapproach.com. And here's an interesting fact. Not only is it an excellent course, but before flying into forecast or known icing conditions, the SR22's Pilot Operating Handbook requires the PIC to complete the Cirrus Icing Awareness course, or a Cirrus-approved equivalent, within the preceding 24 months. So if you're flying a FICI-equipped Cirrus, don't forget to take the course every 2 years. The course is very in-depth and takes an estimated hour and 45 minutes to complete. It includes 10 videos and 8 quizzes. In addition to talking about icing, it goes in-depth into the operation of the FICI system in Cirrus aircraft. Now, TKS anti-icing systems like the one on Cirrus aircraft are also available as a third-party aftermarket option on some models of Cessna aircraft, and I've had 2 clients who've purchased that option. One of them was for a 182, and the other is for the Turbo 206 that's available for rent at my club. And I've recommended that course to people who fly these aircraft. The course does cost $150, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. And I'd like to give a shout-out to Patreon supporter Patrick Mullane, who's written another book. His dad is an astronaut, and a year ago he sent me his first book called The Father, Son, and Holy Shuttle, Growing Up as an Astronaut's Kid in the Glorious 80s. And last month in December, he sent me his latest book called Mullane's Guide to Learning to Fly, Deep Dives into Select Topics for Today's Student Pilot. He says the book is his own history of chasing a lifelong dream to become a private pilot and a sampling of the history and science of aviation. He talks about his first discovery flight in 2021 up through purchasing a share of a Cessna 177. He makes the point that everyone's path to getting a private certificate is different. I like that he includes a chapter on general aviation safety, and he also has a nice treatment of what the FAA calls the impossible turn. And in the acknowledgement page, he has something I've never seen in a book before. He mentions Max Trescott, host of the Aviation News Talk podcast. He says his content is invaluable for new and current pilots. I began listening to him from the day of my first flight lesson and found his insight beyond helpful as I strove to become a skilled and safe pilot. If you're not listening to him, you should be. Pat, thank you so much, and I'll include a link to your Learning to Fly book in our show notes. Now, as I've said before, aviation is a really small community, so see if you know any of these people. We have 2 new mega supporters. Those are the people that sign up to support the show at the $50 a month level or higher. One of them is Dane Jasper, and the other is Christopher Cole, who added his pledge up. We also have a new Patreon supporter, thanks to Mark Jager, and we had a few people who contributed via PayPal. Thanks so much to Thomas Belden. He says, great information, Max. I'm a newer pilot, and you always have great lessons to remember. Thanks also to Mark Putman. He says, love your show. Thanks for describing the physics related to the SR20 and the CAPS parachute. And also thanks to Jason H. And we also had a donation via Venmo from David Codet. He writes, thanks for the great podcast. Wish I could send more. Thank you, David. And thanks to everyone who donates to help support the show. Coming up next, we're talking about the exciting new G7 version of the Cirrus SR22. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about the new G7 version of the SR22. And by the way, everything we talk about today also applies to the SR20, which is also getting an upgrade to the G7 model. And let me say right up front, if you're taking delivery of a new SR22 G7 this year, please contact me if you'd like me to help you bring your aircraft home from the factory. I do lots of these trips, and they are excellent opportunities for you to learn the nuances of these systems from an expert. Also, if you're thinking that you might be interested in buying a Cirrus SR20 or SR22, please contact me before you place the order, as there are some ways that we can help each other. To reach me, just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. Now, yesterday, Cirrus announced the SR22 G7, in a live event held simultaneously in Orlando and Scottsdale, Arizona. I watched it live on YouTube, and at one point I saw that over 6,600 people were viewing the live stream. Todd Simmons, the president of Customer Experience, gave a brief history noting that the company has been in business for 25 years and that they just delivered their 10,000th Cirrus aircraft, including 500 Vision Jets shipped since 2016. The entire fleet has flown more than 16.5 million hours, and more than 250 people have been saved by the CAPS parachute system. The SR22 series has been the best-selling aircraft in its category for 22 years in a row, and the Vision Jet has been the best-selling light jet in personal aviation for 5 years in a row. One thing that Todd noted is that the SF50 Vision Jet drew some of its inspiration from the SR22, and now with the G7, the Vision Jet has returned the favor by helping to inspire new features in the SR22. And just to give you a brief history, Cirrus introduced the SR20 in 1998 and the SR22 in 2001. These early aircraft were equipped with round gauges, and they later became known as the G1 versions of the aircraft. In 2003, the round gauges were replaced with what was to become the first glass cockpit in general aviation, the Avidyne Integra, which included a PFD and MFD. The following year, the G2 airframe came out with a number of improvements, and in 2007, the G3 came out. I visited the factory around that time, and my recollection is they said that there were over 120 improvements that had been made in the G3. It included a longer wing and a 50-pound increase in the max gross weight. In May 2008, the Avidyne glass cockpit in the SR22 was replaced by the Perspective, a Cirrus-branded version of the G1000 that includes some additional features not found in the original G1000. And in 2013, Cirrus introduced the G5, which had a 200-pound gross weight increase, which significantly increased the useful load. But there were no major changes to the avionics. Cirrus, by the way, jumped from the G3 to the G5 as there is no Cirrus G4. In 2017, Cirrus introduced the G6 version with the Perspective Plus avionics. Now, this is the Cirrus-branded version of the G1000 NXI, and its most notable difference is that it has a processor that's 10 times faster than the processor in the Perspective, which makes the system noticeably faster. Now, 7 years later, we have the SR22 G7, and the basic specs have remained relatively unchanged, including the 315 horsepower engine, a maximum altitude of flight level 250, a range of 1,021 nautical miles at 55% power, and a 1,246-pound useful load. I'll get to the avionics in a minute, but first here are some other new features. First, pilots will no longer have to remember to switch fuel tanks, as the new G7 automatically alternates between fuel tanks every 5 gallons to simplify fuel management. This feature was borrowed directly from the Vision Jet, which switches fuel tanks every 2 minutes. The manual fuel valve is still available, but it's been recessed and a cover's placed over it, so it's no longer in sight. And that does give you a little extra free space on the center console between the 2 front seats. If you do need to switch tanks, it's easy to open the cover to access the fuel valve. The G7 also incorporates what may be the very first stick shaker in a piston airplane. Now, stick shakers are common in jets, and they provide strong tactile feedback to pilots to let us know when we're approaching a stall. Personally, I think stick shakers are a lot more effective than stall horns, as they give a strong vibration to the hand that should be doing something, namely pushing forward on the yoke or stick. I really just can't help but wonder how many lives would have been saved if all piston aircraft had stick shakers. The flap switch is also different. The flap positions and the flap speed limitations are now displayed up in the avionics. That system integration lets Cirrus introduce a new safety feature, which is flaps underspeed and overspeed protection. For example, if you extend the flaps and you're going a bit too fast, it will inhibit the flaps from deploying until you've slowed to the flap deployment speed. Now, on the opposite end of the airspeed tape, the flap underspeed protection is going to keep you from retracting the flaps when the plane is going too slow. Now, that's incredibly important, as when you raise flaps, the stall speed increases. And if you raise the flaps when the aircraft is very slow, you can induce an aircraft to stall simply by raising the flaps. When you do that, you are, in essence, shooting yourself down. So these new flap airspeed protections are there to protect you and to protect the plane. There's also a lightweight lithium-ion starter battery that weighs 20 pounds less than the battery in the G6, which certainly helps with the useful load. It's also a smart battery that monitors itself, so make sure you get the most performance out of the battery. And when you do use that battery to start the plane, you'll be doing it with a new push-button starter switch, much like the Vision Jet, that doesn't require a key. Like the Vision Jet, there's an outer ring around that starter button, and you rotate it from the off position to the both magnetos position before starting the plane. And while this may not sound like a big deal, there's now a new storage cubby just below the autopilot where you can put your phone, a small tablet, snacks, sunglasses, or anything you want to keep close at hand. The old G2 used to have a similar cubby on the right side of the plane, and I greatly missed it when it was removed in subsequent models. Cirrus has also relocated the environmental controls to just below the cubby within easy reach of either of the front seats instead of being on the far right side of the plane. Also, they've changed the environmental controls so that they resemble automotive-type air conditioning controls, making it easier for pilots and passengers to understand the buttons. Cirrus has also amped up the accent lighting inside. There's accent lighting overhead and down in the footwells, and they also have a new portfolio of colors and exterior designs. But now let's talk about my favorite part of the airplane, the avionics. Interestingly, during the press event, Cirrus mentioned Garmin just once, but they never mentioned which Garmin avionics are in the G7. Prior to the press event, there was a lot of speculation that the new G7 would include the G2000 avionics. Now I thought it more likely that it would include the G3000 avionics. And if you're unfamiliar with the G2000, well, it's probably because Garmin hasn't sold a lot of these units, which is why I didn't think it would be in the G7. Garmin announced the G2000 way back in March 2011, so almost 13 years ago. And as far as I know, only Cessna bought the system, and they installed it in the Corvallis TTX, which was their name for the original Columbia 400 aircraft that they acquired after Columbia went bankrupt. Cessna never sold many Corvallis aircraft, and so you may never have seen a G2000. But here's the interesting thing. The G2000 and G3000 share some of the same components, notably the large GDU 1400W, which are the 14-inch displays used for the PFD and MFD in both systems. So as of right now, I can't tell you for sure whether the hardware is the G2000 or the G3000, and it doesn't matter. Because what's more important than the hardware used is that Cirrus did announce on their website that the G7 is going to be using the Perspective Touch Plus, and that is the same software used in the Vision Jet. Note that many of the changes in the G7 were made to make it more similar to the Vision Jet, and that's not a coincidence. Cirrus clearly has made these changes to make it easier for customers to step up from the SR22 to the Vision Jet. Now, when the Vision Jet was first announced over 15 years ago, Cirrus said that the jet would have the same perspective avionics found in the SR20 and SR22, and that would have made it very easy for pilots to transition into the Vision Jet. But somewhere along the way, Cirrus changed the Vision Jet design and instead outfitted it with the Perspective Touch avionics and later with the Perspective Touch Plus. While it shares the Perspective name with the avionics in the SR20s and the SR22, that's where the similarity ends. Just as the Perspective is the Cirrus-branded and enhanced version of the G1000, the Perspective Touch Plus, found in the Vision Jet, is the Cirrus-branded and enhanced version of the Garmin G3000. And the G1000 and the G3000 are completely different systems. How different? Well, when I first went to Knoxville to get type-rated in the Vision Jet about 5.5 years ago, I found it very difficult to wrap my mind around the G3000. Initially, I found it very difficult to use, and I just didn't like the system. So at night, after everyone had left, I would stay at the Vision Center and practice using the G3000 touch trainers. And as I became more familiar with the G3000, I absolutely fell in love with it. So G7 owners are in for a real treat, because while initially they may find it challenging to learn the new system, once they do learn it, they're going to find that it's an easier system to use than the G1000 and Perspective Plus. And if you want to get a head start on learning how to use the new Perspective Touch Plus system in the SR22 G7, here's an easy way to do that. My Max Trescott's G3000 and G5000 class cockpit handbook covers virtually all of the features you'll find in the Perspective Touch Plus used in the G7. Now, the G3000 is implemented in different ways in different manufacturers' aircraft. And where there are differences, I've used icons in the book so that users of different systems can easily pick out the differences that apply to their version of the G3000. So if you plan to fly the SR22 G7, all you need to do is look for the horizontal display icon and the letters SF50, because those highlight the differences unique to the Perspective Touch Plus that's used in the SF50 and will now be used in the SR22 G7. And that horizontal display icon, well, it refers to the touchscreen controllers used in the SF50 and the SR22 G7, and I'll explain what those are in a moment. To get my book, just call 800-247-6553 and ask for Max Trescott's G3000 and G5000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. You can also find a link in our show notes at aviationnewstalk.com so that you can order the book online. Now, I mentioned that the SR22 G7 has a pair of 14-inch displays used for the PFD and MFD. These displays are 35% larger than the displays in the G6, and these displays offer 3 times more resolution, making them ideal for viewing charts or keeping an eye on the weather. You can also split both the PFD and the MFD so that you have 4 separate windows. Unlike all other G2000 and G3000 installations, there are no soft keys along the bottom of the displays. Now, I'm sure Cirrus did this so that the top of the display would be lower than it would be if there were soft keys, resulting in a better view outside through the windshield. So even though these displays are larger, they don't take away from that excellent view that you're used to seeing from the front seat of a Cirrus. Now, instead of soft keys, there are a pair of touchscreen controllers that are mounted below the displays. In most G3000 installations, the touchscreen controllers are oriented vertically, and the Vision Jet was the first installation to use horizontally oriented touchscreen controllers, and again, this was probably done to keep the avionics from becoming higher and restricting the view out the window. The SR22 G7 uses those same horizontal touchscreen controllers used in the SF50, and these controllers were the inspiration for the icon I use in my G3000 book to let people know which parts of the book are unique to the SF50 and the SR22 G7. The default is for the touchscreen controller on the left to control the PFD and the MFD. On the home screen, you'll find large icons for each of the major functions you can control, and many of those icons are the same ones used in the Garmin GTN 650 and 750 navigators. So if you've used one of those GPS units, you already have some familiarity with how to use some of the functions in the Perspective Touch Plus used in the G7. Now, one big difference is the flight planning, which differs considerably between those two units. The other touchscreen controller, located on the right, is used to control all the radios and audio in the aircraft. Note that you never want to touch the large displays. All of your interactions will be through the smaller touchscreen controllers. Cirrus has also simplified the bolster panel, removing the avionics switch and the nav light switch. The oxygen switch is now within the bolster panel, and oxygen pressure is displayed on the engine information strip on the MFD. The system also has 3D Safe Taxi. It'll show you things like hangars, buildings, and the actual taxiway signs, so you'll know exactly where you're going on the airport. There's also a new function called taxiway routing. You can think of it as a flight plan for your taxi route. After you enter your taxi instructions, magenta lines are drawn on the airport map. Now, one of my new favorite features brought over from the Vision Jet is the checklist scroll wheel. This handy wheel just makes it a breeze to scroll through checklists, plus the scroll wheel doubles as a button so that you can mark completed items. Also, there appears to be a redesigned placard for the CAPS parachute handle, which addresses a key issue I've always had in these planes, as much as I love them. This wasn't mentioned in the press event, but from the photos, you can clearly see that the placard is no longer a removable cover that goes on top of the parachute handle. Instead, the placard appears to be mounted on the ceiling next to the parachute handle. I've never liked the idea that the placard was between me and the handle, because I can imagine that if I were in a spin and disoriented, that it would take precious seconds to fumble above my head to try to remove the placard to get to the handle. There are a couple of ways to move the old placard and still leave it in sight, but this new solution solves the problem of accessing the handle while still leaving the placard plainly in sight. Thank you, Cirrus. There's also a restyled throttle lever that borrows design cues from the Vision Jet. Cirrus has also installed cup holders by each seat that are molded into the side of the plane. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but it really is. All prior SR20s and SR22s have had plastic cup holders that fold down from the side of the cabin. And unfortunately, when pilots forget to close those cup holders, it's easy for the next person climbing into the plane to step on the cup holder and break it. I don't think I've ever broken one, but I know for a long time I didn't realize how important it was to close them, as I've seen many, many broken cup holders in the Cirrus aircraft in my club. Cirrus has also added more USB-C ports for charging. There are now 3 15-watt ports and one 60-watt USB-C port conveniently located for all passengers. Cirrus has also done some drag reduction. They now make the seam between the Fiki panel and the wing surface smoother, resulting in reduced drag. Wheel fairings have also been redesigned with smaller gaps around the wheels, resulting in reduced drag. And here's something really interesting that was not mentioned during the press event. One of my clients, Jeremy Webb, noticed in the photos that are on the website that there don't appear to be any standby instruments. So apparently Cirrus and the FAA now feel that the redundancy in the electrical system is sufficient that one doesn't need backup instruments. Boy, I sure hope they're right. That's what I can tell you for now. Next week I'm going to be in Knoxville, and hopefully I'll learn even more about this exciting new plane, and I'll share that with you in future shows. And just a reminder, if you are taking delivery of a new SR22 G7, contact me if you'd like help bringing your aircraft home from the factory. And if you're thinking about buying a new Cirrus SR20 or SR22, please contact me before you place the order. Again, to reach me, just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until you're silent, baby, sliding upside down.